this is, for me, a really important way for us to begin any kōrero that we have with various audiences. For me, this mihi really shows the direction, or shows the way in which Taumata Arawai takes its lead from Te Mano o Te Wai. And it's about that reciprocal relationship, looking after the health and well-being of the water so that it can in turn nourish us as people and the environment. This has been a big piece of work, or part of our whakapapa for Taumata Arawai over the past 2 years, as we've firstly become a Crown entity and as we continue our journey to becoming the new Water Services Regulator. We've been really privileged and fortunate to work with iwi leaders across the motu in developing some of our key po of our whakapapa of who we are as Taumata Arawai. You'll be probably familiar with this landscape. It sounds like you've had some workshops already as council staff and councillors. Just on your screen here is just, I guess, showing that wider view of where we fit into the landscape. So the Three Waters reform in its broader sense has been a system-wide reform, and it's around achieving that long-lasting intergenerational benefits. So on your screen here, you have 3 boxes, or what Minister Mahuta often refers to them as the 3 po, or the 3 pillars. So we have Taumata Arawai as the new dedicated water services regulator, and the regulatory reform. So that's the regulatory regime that Taumata Arawai will administer, and that's contained within the Water Services Bill. And then the service delivery reform, which I see you'll be spending most of your time today talking about, and that's what Nick and the rest of the Department of Internal Affairs team will take you through. You see on screen there, we became a Crown entity on the 1st of March. So before that, we had been an establishment unit nestled within the Department of Internal Affairs. So work on establishing Taumata Arawai started in late 2019, with a lot of policy proposals being approved in the years prior to that. As a Crown entity, we're governed by a board. That board is chaired by Dame Karen Potasi, who was also on the panel for the government inquiry into the Havelock North incident. We also have a Māori advisory group, and that is chaired by Tipa Mahuta. Taumata Arawai is still in its process of recruiting its permanent staff, its permanent whānau, but probably tracking towards about 75–85% there. And as I've mentioned already, we have 2 of us here on this call. Some of you, probably most of you, will be familiar with our Chief Executive, Bill Bayfield, who has a long-standing history with the Taranaki region. Just quickly here, just really important just to touch on what we will be responsible and what we won't be responsible for as the Water Services Regulator. It's about the leadership around the 3 waters, holding ourselves and water service suppliers to account, setting, promoting, advising, monitoring and enforcing national standards for safe drinking water, promoting and advising on, and often it's called a shining a light role in regards to wastewater and stormwater delivery and regulatory performance. And that last one there is really key, and it's about, if we're to be successful in those previous points, it's really about building those strong relationships built on trust and confidence. Taumata Arawai will not be responsible for the supply of any of the 3 waters utilities. It's not a funder. Taumata Arawai won't be regulating access to water, and that includes for irrigation. It also includes that we won't be regulating the water bottling industry. In terms of the Three Waters reform or the review into local government, that is not our role or our responsibility, and Taumata Arawai is not an economic regulator. Just to touch base here on who will be regulated. So the Water Services Bill, which you'll probably be familiar with, and which I talked about is that second code, that provides for Taumata Arawai to regulate all drinking water supplies in New Zealand. But it doesn't allow for the regulation of domestic self-suppliers. In the last bullet point there, so businesses that use water only for food preparation will not be regulated under that bill, or what will eventually become an act. Just quickly here, this just shows the progress of the Water Services Bill. It has come through the Select Committee process, and it attracted just over 1,000 submissions. The committee spent a lot of time with submitters through that oral submission period, and then they tabled their report last month in August. We're now waiting for, I guess, the parliamentary timetable to resume or to settle post this current lockdown, for it to then head into second reading and Committee of the Whole House in its final stages. Really important for us to note in all our conversations that we're having that until this Water Services Bill becomes an act, the current regulator of drinking water is the Ministry of Health, and that will remain until the Water Services Act commences. So at this point, we're working towards Taumata Arawai assuming that responsibility for drinking water regulation later this year. In terms of waste and stormwater, those provisions within the Water Services Bill, they will not be brought into force at the same time as the rest of the bill. They will come 2 years after the commencement. And that's really been a decision to allow for Taumata Arawai to really bed in its regulatory functions in regards to drinking water. As you'll see on the screen there, regional councils, they will remain primary regulators of waste and stormwater discharges. There will be a stronger national level oversight of those functions by Taumata Arawai. I spoke about the House Select Committee submitting their report back on the Water Services Bill, and in that report back they have made a number of recommendations to then be agreed to or passed through the second reading process. Some key ones there are just on the screen. End point treatment, that's now really clear in the bill that can only be used if it's part of an acceptable solution. Taumata Arawai will have at this point 3 acceptable solutions, or what they're sometimes called as safe harbours, options for particular types of drinking water supplies to utilise. Backflow, there's also a change here where a supplier can will have a bit more say in terms of what building owners need to have in terms of a backflow device and its installation. Review of drinking water safety plans, that now has a stronger link to the compliance monitoring and enforcement strategy. That's something that Taumata Arawai must prepare and review every 3 years, and that really communicates and articulates the approach that Taumata Arawai is going to take in terms of compliance monitoring and enforcement, and I guess the phasing of that as well. Acceptable solutions. A real clarification here that a water supplier must still meet the requirement to provide safe drinking water if an acceptable solution has been adopted. However, a drinking water safety plan will not be required if an acceptable solution has been adopted. Residual disinfection exemptions. This has now sort of decoupled the residual disinfection from the exemption powers, so that Taumata Arawai has some discretion in this space. Entry and search, a lot of submissions were related to this. So now Taumata Arawai must have consent to enter onto private home and marae. And then the transitional provisions, this is a real key change here. This is, there's a key split. So those water suppliers that are currently registered under the Ministry of Health regime, their registration will transfer over. And then Taumata Arawai and those currently unregistered water suppliers will have a longer period. So now it's, previously it had been that it was by end of year 1, all those unregistered suppliers needed to be registered, and by the end of year 5, either have an acceptable solution or have a drinking water safety plan. That's moved now to 3 years for registration and 5 years for coming under the regulatory regime. In a minute, I'll talk a little bit about the supplementary order paper that the Minister has tabled. However, there are day 1 duties for all suppliers, and that is around a duty of care to their communities. All right, I'll just finish with a little bit on where we're heading, and also a little bit more information about how Taumata Arawai, particularly in the regulatory space, has organised itself. Right from the start, I spoke about us taking the lead from Te Mano Te Wai, and then coupled with that as well is that duty of care aspect, and the duty of care to supply safe drinking water. So that applies from day 1. We also talk about, I guess, the culture shift here, and it's away from, I guess, having a water safety plan to the act of continuous risk management planning. A key change between the current regime, the Ministry of Health, to Taumata Arawai, is that water safety plans will be reviewed, but they will not be approved. And that's to I guess, retain that practice or that responsibility of that risk management planning with the supplier. And Taumata Arawai will provide guidance. The focus will be on the drinking water suppliers taking accountability and conducting good risk management practices. There will be a number of regulations that will need to come following the Water Services Act passing, and the Water Services Bill currently places clear obligations on Taumata Arawai leading some of that, the consultation process behind those, and so that's drinking water standards, compliance rules, aesthetic values, and the acceptable solutions or verification methods. We had previously been planning to start that consultation this side of Christmas. Given everything that's happening across the broader landscape at the moment, we've made the decision to conduct that consultation next year, so early next year. So that means when Taumata Arawai first becomes a regulator, it will still be using the current standards and rules, and that will the key point or time frame for change to those new standards and rules will be July 2022. Regulatory delivery, as I introduced, we have one of our team leads, Peter Wood, here with us today. He's based in Palmerston North. We have 5 regions essentially. So Peter in Palmerston North, we have Jodie Pickering, and she's in the Waikato region. Then we have 2 officers in Te Waiponamu, so Christchurch and Dunedin. And then we also have a team lead in Wellington who will be working with the big suppliers. We have Hine Korako, that will be a new regulatory and intelligence platform, and that will be where water suppliers will be coming in to register, and that'll be sort of that way of interfacing, or one way of interfacing with Taumata Arawai. Before I talked about that transition of registrations from those who are currently registered to Taumata Arawai, and so that will be led by the likes of Peter and his colleagues, so the regulatory team leaders. And my colleague, Ray McMillan, is the head of regulatory, and he will be based in Wellington, but no doubt will be spending a lot of time around the Motu. Another important role of Taumata Arawai, and a lot of thinking is going into this right now, is our emergency preparedness. And this is a key task, is planning around what Taumata Arawai will do in emergencies. The Water Services Bill currently includes powers to address both quality and quantity emergencies. And Matt Carey is our lead advisor in this space, and he's currently scoping out some exercises to really prepare Taumata Arawai for the incident and emergency response space. Right, so just to recap, Taumata Arawai and the Ministry of Health, we're working closely together to ensure that smooth handover. And probably just on your screen there, really important one that I just want to really highlight is that regardless of the outcome of the 3 water service delivery reform, Taumata Arawai will regulate in accordance with our legislation regardless. Yes. What I did is I just might have a quick look. I've seen a lot of questions coming through. All right.
Do you want us to help you with that, Katie? Kia ora for your presentation. Would you like us to help you just facilitate some of those questions?
Yes, please. That would be really great. I'm just having a quick little look at them. And I'll also ask Peter, if you are able to help out with any of these questions as well, please chime in.
Right, so the first one we've got here for our DIA presenters is from Councillor Moahu, and he has asked that question I'm sure a lot of people are interested in, is what is Taumata Arawai's role in regulating consents to foreign companies, you know, the ones that come in and extract and export many litres of our lovely water, and then if it's not Taumata Arawai, which government agency is responsible for that one?
The decisions around consents for allocation of water, and that currently sits with regional councils under the Resource Management Act.
Right.
So in short, no, Taumata Arawai will not be regulating in that regard.
Right, you happy with that one, Denny? Okay.
That's an answer.
Good, thank you. So the next one, Amanda has asked a question about fluoridation, which I see the Mayor has answered later on. The Director General will be responsible for fluoride decisions on behalf of the government. That's our understanding. I see some nods there from Katie, so I think we can take that one as
that's correct.
Answered. Councillor Bublitz has asked who will be in charge of single dwellings if Taumata Arawai is not regulating them.
Oh, that's a good question. I see Peter's taken his. Peter, you can take this one.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa ko Peter Woodaho. So the single dwellings are currently regulated under the Building Act. So for the Building Act remains effectively unchanged, and that single dwellings is covered then by the district and city councils.
Yep, excellent. Right, thank you. Councillor Johnson, what happens to the stormwater between now and when Taumata Arawai take over? As you're not commencing looking after that for the end of the first 2 years, I would imagine it's just status quo applies to that one, is it? But
you're correct, yeah, status quo, so regulated by regional councils. The role of Taumata Arawai is really about pulling together that national view of stormwater, stormwater performance. So yeah, status quo at this point in time.
okay, good. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Cheers, Colin. Thanks. Richard has asked, will the regulations be scientifically based, or will there be a shift in more cultural values?
Peter, do you want to take this one, or do you want me to? You're much more technically with the regulations and the standards and rules.
So I think again the bulk of the standards and rules will still very much be scientifically based. So we're still looking at having maximum acceptable values as exists in the standards currently. But from the perspective of Te Mana o Te Wai, we are looking at how we would incorporate cultural values through source water risk management planning, and also looking at how water suppliers can include that cultural knowledge of that describes some of the features that the water bodies have into their plans as well.
Okay, kia ora, Peter. Happy with that, Richard?
I did, Craig, but it doesn't. How do you define cultural values, Peter? Who will assess those?
So
at the moment, it's scientific, so it's quite regulated, and it's under a scientific system.
The standards will still be science based. There are, however, this is one of the challenges that we have to wrestle with, because actually the cultural values that may be that mana whenua would have with particular water bodies vary really between different iwi and different hapu. And I'm quite conscious that I've done a lot of work up the Whanganui River, which has legal status of a person. And that, I think, is something that those water suppliers and Taumata Arawai will have to engage with those groups in terms of what that will mean for those groups. There are also some parts of the area which I'm in where I think it's fair to say that mana whenua knew things about the water body that water suppliers have ignored at our peril, because we're now having to treat for things which local iwi knew were a problem. Local mana whenua knew were a problem to start with. So I think there is a conversation to be had.
Peter. Right.
Can I have one, Craig, please?
Yeah, hang on. I'll just, yep. I'll carry on then, Marty. Yep.
Can you please explain how rural dwellings will be affected by the new regulations? Many of them have their own supplies by tank or bore. and they often supply multiple dwellings for employees. How will they be affected under the new regulations?
Well, kia ora for that question. So they will come under the regulatory regime. If they're currently unregistered, they'll come under the regulatory regime, or they'll be registered in 4 years' time, and then they'll have 7 years to work with us around becoming compliant under the regulatory regime, whether that's the uptake of an acceptable solution. We know that there are a lot of rural dwellings out there that have that particular situation that you've just described. Taumata Arawai will be looking to really work with those communities to understand those characteristics, complexities, and the risks faced for those particular dwellings. We've begun engagement and working with our sort of other central government colleagues through the likes of Ministry for Primary Industries, and they also have Assure Quality. We've been meeting with, we met with Fonterra earlier this week. Our Chief Executive and the Minister met with Federated Farmers last week. So we're really looking to engage more fulsomely, but the important thing is that we have time.
Thank you, Katie. So it'll be a work in progress and there will be consultation.
Correct, yeah, and engagement, working together.
It will be very complex, and I can see with Fonterra being involved and Federated Farmers that you've already started dialogue with those two. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you.
Right, excellent, thanks. I think we'll flick back to the list now. We've got a couple more here. Councillor Bennett has asked about consultation. I'm sure you and the team were expecting that one to come up, guys. Consultation with our communities at some time. Well, I think you're talking about the water reforms here, aren't you, Sam?
Yeah, that's right, Craig. It just appears to me at the moment that the cart is well before the horse. Our communities, we're getting rung every day by our community asking when do we get consulted, because it affects us directly. And so I'd really like to know why the community hasn't been consulted prior to all of this work happening. If somebody could clarify that for me, it would be wonderful. Thank you.
I can address that in relation to the broader reforms, if you like. So I guess the stage that we're working through at the moment is, we've been in a policy development stage, and that has been a process that has involved kind of close partnership with local government sector through the Joint Central Local Government Three Waters Steering Committee. There has also been engagement with local authorities as the owners of the assets sort of through that process. In terms of where we're at in the process at the moment, and in discussion with LGNZ, what we've agreed is that we'll take the next couple of months to engage councils and continue engagement with iwi Māori, particularly around ensuring that everyone has got a common understanding of the policy proposals, because they are complex and they are significant, and the government has asked for feedback from the sector on those proposals, and at that point the Minister has said that she will then make decisions around what the next stages are, including the sort of the role for public consultation. So it will be an evolving conversation.
Thanks for your response, Nick. I still believe that the cart is well before the horse, and that concerns me.
All right, thanks, Sam. Look, just for a little bit of clarity, guys, this first bit of questioning is around the Taumata Arawai presentation in particular. I think, Nick, you're going to come on to a second one about the wider reforms, are you, shortly? So if you've got reform questions, guys, just try and hold those for now. We want to focus this in on the Taumata Arawai stuff that Katie's just presented, if we can. Otherwise, we'll get all crossed up. So just there's another one on the list here from Councillor Moahu, Taumata Arawai's role in the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management.
Kia ora, Councillor Moahu. No, Taumata Arawai is not responsible for the National Policy Statement for Freshwater. That sits within the Ministry for the Environment. We will be very closely connected to it though, in regard to Taumata Aroa being required to give effect to Te Mano Te Wai. So this is where we really need to start being more, having more sort of cross-agency connection and cohesiveness.
Happy with that, Denny?
Kapai.
Kapai. Right, and the last one I can see here on my list anyway is from Councillor Carlson. A question of rural dwellings don't want to be compliant. Will there be penalties for those dwellings or enforcement?
That's a tough one to give a blanket answer to, but Taumata Aroa will have a range of, I guess, tools that we can use around compliance, and it would be probably just more that specific situation and working with that water supply. Might be talking more about the adoption of an acceptable solution, or it might be even a conversation around continuing to supply water. It really depends on that particular context. Peter, I don't know if you have anything further to add to that.
No, I don't think so. I think it is at the moment a very hard question to answer before the bill has even completed its passage through the House.
Katie and Peter, sorry, Craig, I just wondered whether at this point it may be worth just emphasising that there are provisions within the Water Services Bill that would place obligations and duties onto local authorities around ensuring safe drinking water, and that includes in relation to private and community supplies. So if there are issues of sustained, non-compliance, then there is an obligation that sits there within the regulatory proposals that would sit on councils. And I think that's relevant because it has a bearing on how you think about the service delivery reforms as well.
Indeed, and I think it's probably fair to say there is some trepidation amongst the sector around some of those provisions, guys, but we won't go down that rabbit hole right now.
Oh, yes, of course. And thank you, Nick. Sorry, I forgot to include and make note of that during the presentation.
Yeah, cheers, Nick. Right, are we almost at the end of our Taumata Aroa questions? I'll just have a quick squiz down here. Councillor Bublitz wants to know, is there a list of who's in charge of what? David, would you like to just elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, just following on from Councillor Moiahu, really, around National Policy for Fresh Water, there seems to be lots of different agencies in charge of different areas. Is there a one-pager where we could potentially get some clarity around who's actually in what box, or what part of the water is in whose box?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I can understand where that's come from because lots of my answers have pointed to other parts of Wellington. If I can just quickly jump onto our website while we're still talking, I could quickly screen share. On our website, we have got a graphic or a diagram that sort of shows the relationship between regulators and policy makers across Taumata Aroa, Ministry for the Environment, Ministry for Health and Internal Affairs. So I will try and get that up onto the screen quickly before we finish up.
Even if you can just share it, that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Cool.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for that, Katie. That'd be useful. And the final one, I think, by the looks of it, is from Councillor Hitchcock. Can you please expand on the regulation for stormwater and the key areas of concern you're looking to address through regulation? Obviously, this is that one that's a little bit down the line yet, but
yeah, I think that is a little bit down the line, and it could look different now to it does in 2 years. But primarily around waste and stormwater, it's been about just having that national picture of performance, and that's been the key thing that Minister Mahuta has been driving or seeking to achieve through the role that Taumata Aroa will have. My understanding with stormwater is that it's incredibly complex, which I'm sure you'll be aware of. And so that is an area, and I'm pleased that at this point we have got 2 years to really understand how we collect that information and then how we turn that into performance reporting, which can actually be helpful.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Katie. Right, I think we've exhausted the questions on the Taumata Arawai presentation, so perhaps it's a good time to segue across. Nick, are you taking the lead on the next bit, or one of your team, or?
Yeah, I'm gonna kick us off. So what we're going to do in the sort of the next part of the workshop is focus in on the service delivery reform proposal. So I'll provide a bit of an overview of the reform program, the case for change, the summary of the proposals, the main features of the proposed entities. I'll also touch on the government's financial support package and what we're sort of looking for from the kind of current 8 weeks of engagement period. And then will take us through a bit more detail on how iwi Māori voice and influence will work and what the reforms mean for iwi Māori as well. But we might sort of chunk it up. So perhaps once I've given an overview, we might sort of pause there and take some questions and things about the reforms generally, and then kind of dive into some of those other issues in a bit more detail, if that makes sense.
Yep, sounds good, Nick.
Okay. Marianne, can you share the slides?
Okay, Nick, yes, I'm trying to get there. Just a moment. Is that showing on your screens now?
Hasn't come through yet.
Well, there appears to be an issue with my sharing, sorry. No, I'm just wondering if you're able to share a copy, please.
Is that working?
Yes, it is. We can see
Yeah,
that.
that's good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, couple, Nick. I'll drive from here. You go.
Thanks, now. So if we just go to the first sort of slide. I don't know, is your screen maximized? It's a little bit, oh, you've shrunk it, that's good. So as kind of Katie's already sort of touched on, there are multiple facets of the Three Waters reforms. So Katie's already spoken about the regulatory changes that are contained in the Water Services Bill, which provides more teeth in the regulatory framework around holding suppliers to account for meeting sort of safe drinking water standards, and has talked about the oversight responsibilities that Taumata Arawai will have in relation to wastewater and stormwater as well. So I'm not going to cover those off again as part of this presentation, but if there are questions around those that emerge, we're happy to sort of try and tackle those. So my focus is on the third of the items listed below and on the service delivery reform proposal. So these relate to the proposals to transfer the delivery of drinking water, wastewater and aspects of stormwater to new water services entities, as well as additional regulatory change, including the introduction of economic regulation. Now, if you could just move on. Okay, so we've already heard this morning in a number of the questions highlighted that there is a lot going on in relation to water and service delivery of water services. And I just sort of wanted to try to locate some of the sort of discussion. So we are particularly focused within the service delivery reform program on the delivery of water services. So the focus here is on the infrastructure, it's on the plants, the pipes, and how they are governed, managed, financed, and delivered. They do relate, the proposals do relate to other reforms to the wider environment affecting the use of water. So you're familiar with the NPS freshwater management. There's been questions that have come up already around water allocation and RM reform. They are related to but distinct from the reform proposals that I'll be talking about. Of course, all of this is situated in a broader framework of Te Mana o Te Wai. So these are sort of challenging conversations in terms of trying to kind of keep these things separate, but we'll try today to focus in particular on the service delivery elements of reform. No. So I won't dwell on this. You would have been briefed on the case for change by council officers in your previous workshop. The challenges facing our three waters are well documented. We know across the country we've got issues with drinking water quality. Obviously you'll be familiar with Havelock North, but it's far from an isolated incident. So we've had instances of lead contamination. We see around 35,000 cases of acute gastrointestinal illness each year attributed to reticulated drinking water. Around the country, we've had issues with drinking water compliance. If you move beyond drinking water and look at the wastewater system, that is clearly under pressure. We've got significant numbers of dry weather and wet weather overflows across the country. Of the 320 odd wastewater treatment plants around the country, around 60 need significant upgrades to meet minimum standards under the NPS freshwater management. More than 100 of our wastewater plants are in breach of consent, and a third will require reconsenting within the next decade. In terms of stormwater, it's less studied and less well understood, but what we do know about stormwater is that the stormwater systems will face many of the same challenges around the need for investment exacerbated by climate change, and there's a large price tag to fix this. So the modelling and analysis that has been undertaken and the evidence base that's been built up over the 4 years of the Three Waters Review, and most recently overseen by the Joint Central Local Government Steering Committee, estimates that between 120 and $180 billion of investment is required over the next 30 to 40 years across the country, and that investment challenge is going to be difficult for some communities to afford. The flip side of that, of course, is that if we get on top of that investment, that in itself will have a stimulatory impact on the economy. So there is a need, obviously, to, well, it creates employment and will add value. And I think it's important to note that that's right across the country, and the analysis indicates that the sort of the smaller and rural provincial areas will be disproportionately benefited by that. Now, if you could move on. So just to put that investment challenge in context, historically, when we've looked across all councils across the country, in the past, it's the capex on an annual basis has averaged around 1.5 billion per annum. There definitely has been some acknowledgement of the challenges and provision for greater investment within the current LTPs. And we've seen that systematically across the country. And so over the period 21 to 31, we're seeing, I think, around $2.7 billion of projected capital expenditure per year. But if you sort of step back and you think about the accumulated infrastructure deficit and the need to sort of catch up on some of that spending to address aging infrastructure in some places and to address the kind of need to meet those standards, we're really looking at as a country at needing to invest at the rate of about 4 billion to 6 billion over the next 30 years. There's been a lot of discussion about how that can be done more efficiently and whether the modelling that's been supplied is realistic in that regard. You may have heard figures that sort of talk about a 45% increase in efficiency, and it's fair to say that that has been met with some sort of raised eyebrows in some quarters. It's the first thing that I just wanted to note around that is that is a change over quite a long period of time. If you think about it as a cumulative annual improvement, it equates to around 2% improvement in operating efficiency over 30 years, or if we can get on top of it faster, it's about 4% per annum over 15 years, which is what's been achieved in other jurisdictions that have undertaken these types of reforms. In order to attain those efficiencies, the evidence strongly suggests that you do need a minimum sort of level of scale, and that's been estimated in the order of 600 to 800,000 connections, and that's why we've ended up with the proposal that we have around the number and size of the entities. In terms of where the efficiencies come from, there's a bit of a misconception that it's about joining up physical networks and extending connections, and that's the source of the underlying efficiency, but that's actually not the case. The efficiency improvements come through strengthened governance and workforce capabilities. So with scale, you can get much more specialised management, procurement efficiencies. So taking a long-term view around how you manage that large capital program and driving cost out of the supply chain through smarter asset management. So the ability to invest in technologies, for example, that enable you to understand your networks, how they're performing, and target maintenance and renewal expenditure in a way that kind of avoids future cost, and the disciplines that will be brought by economic regulation, which will drive an efficiency challenge on the entities. It's probably worth noting as well that even Watercare in Auckland, which is easily our most efficient water services provider, has a board that's accepted that it can make around 4.5% per annum improvement over 10 years. So these efficiencies aren't out of the order of what's possible. Now, and just to kind of further accentuate this point, the model that is proposed is not that novel, really, when you look around the place. So if you look across the Australian states, most of them have undertaken these sorts of reforms. Similarly, in the UK and Scotland, and by and large, the economic regulators are setting efficiency objectives for their water utilities of between 2 and 4%, and the companies are using a range of ways of making those improvements. So I just wanted to make those points because I'm sort of anticipating that there may be some questions about that later. So then on to the sort of reform proposals themselves. So what the government has proposed is the establishment of 4 publicly owned water services entities. The main role of these entities will be to deliver safe, reliable, efficient water services. There are protections in place against future privatisation. I'll cover that off in a little bit more detail. The proposal is that the entities would be owned and operated by territorial authorities on behalf of communities, but they do involve the transfer of the underlying water assets and associated debt from councils and off the balance sheet into these new structures. The entities are proposed to be governed by competency-based boards overseen by representative oversight mechanisms, and I will talk a little bit more about those too. Now we'll talk more about the mechanisms that are baked into the proposals to protect and promote iwi Māori rights and interests. And as I mentioned, there'll be an economic regulatory regime which is there to protect consumers and to provide strong incentives for investment and performance. And what the economic regulator will do will be to set the maximum allowable revenue that these entities can charge, and also to set the efficiency challenges that the entities must meet. So a little bit more about the purpose and objectives of the entities. As I said, they're there to provide safe, reliable, efficient water services. So they will have a dedicated focus on water services delivery and nothing else. There will also be in statute recognition of a number of objectives that they will have. So these will relate to the promotion of public health and the environment, supporting and enabling housing and urban development, and ensuring that they act in the best interests of consumers and communities and give effect to mana o te wai. So a little bit more on the ownership and protections against privatisation. As I mentioned, there's a little bit of confusion in some of the discussions we've had around who the owners of the entities are. The proposals are clear that it's local authorities who are the owners of the entity, and that's on behalf of their communities. However, it's a bit different to a kind of a shareholding or sort of company type of ownership structure. So there is no proposal for shareholding and no sort of financial benefit from ownership, and that reflects the fact that ultimately consumers have to pay for any kind of returns that entities might generate, and because of the significant infrastructure deficit, the intention is that any surplus that the entities might make gets reinvested into the infrastructure. Mana whenua, and we'll sort of talk about this a little bit more, would have a joint oversight role, but that is distinct from local authorities' ownership interest. There are protections proposed in terms of future privatisation. This has sort of been one of the risks that's been raised with the proposal. So, as is currently the case, there will be the same protections that exist in relation to privatisation, with local authorities being written into the statute as the owners on behalf of their communities, but there will be additional protections as well. So any proposal for privatisation that that a sort of a regional representative group might want to bring to the table would need at least a 75% majority for it to proceed. And then if it were to proceed, then it would also need to be put to a public referendum, which would also require a 75% majority in order for that proposal to proceed. And there are a number of other proposed ways in which the entities are set up, which would make it difficult for these entities to be privatised. One of the things that we've spent a lot of time on in terms of the sort of the policy development and that government's taken decisions around is how we can ensure that local communities continue to have influence over the entities, and that ultimately the entities are accountable back to the communities that they serve. So there are a number of kind of mechanisms baked into the proposed model that are intended to achieve this. So the representative oversight group will issue its expectations and aspirations for the entities that the entities will be required to take into account in their planning and reflect in the statement of corporate intent. The entities will also be subject to many of the same sorts of consultation obligations and engagement obligations that local government currently faces in terms of their own planning processes, including around the development of that investment plans and pricing and charging plans. So those will be highly transparent processes and subject to consultation and input from communities and from customers. There will be a consumer forum for each of the entities, which will be there to kind of represent the kind of consumer interest, and economic regulation is also obviously there to kind of protect consumer interest and to ensure value for money in terms of the services provided. Another area of interest and concern that we hear about is in relation to how the water services entities will be made responsive to local plans for growth and development. This is an area obviously that with reforms to the resource management system and the spatial planning changes is made slightly more challenging, but from a Three Waters service delivery policy perspective, Cabinet's made it very clear in its decisions that it expects water services entities to be plan takers, not plan makers. So local government will continue to have primary accountability for urban and land use planning. The entities will be expected to engage meaningfully and participate in those processes, including making it clear what the cost implications are of growth and development plans. But ultimately, once plans are made, water services entities will be required by law to give effect to their component of those plans in terms of supporting and enabling growth. And as now with the likes of development contributions, there will be a growth funding framework that the entities will operate with. So I'll probably just, Craig, I don't know whether you want to sort of stop there and sort of take questions now, or whether we should just rattle through the rest of it and then open up for a general discussion at the end.
I think we should rattle on, actually, Nick. Most of our attendees have got a reasonable idea about Entity B, so there'll be a bit of repetition in here. So feel free to move through that quite quickly, and then we'll come back to the questions, because there's 3 or 4 themes that emerged last week during our first workshop, and we said, "Oh, right, great question for DIA next week." So we want to get to some of those themes. But just carry on in the meantime, I think, Nick.
Okay, so I'll make sure I'll sort of move through this pretty quickly. So you'll be familiar with the sort of the Entity B proposals. Obviously 21 councils involved in that area across Taranaki, Waikato, Bay of Plenty, and the upper parts of Whanganui, Manawatu. The connected population around 800,000, that's sort of, as I mentioned earlier, within that sort of scale where you need to be to achieve those sort of efficiency benefits. It will be the smallest entity upon establishment, but one of the fastest growing areas, and you will have seen the sort of the cost comparison there in terms of the modelling, which suggests that on average councils across that area in 2051 would pay around $4,000 per household to kind of deliver the investment and continue to operate the services. Whereas with reform, that number is substantially less. The red circles on there just highlight that when Cabinet considered the entity decisions, it did highlight that there were some choices at the margins around the boundary issues. And obviously one of those rings is around that sort of Taranaki area and the upper parts of Whanganui Bay of Plenty. So I guess just briefly to explain that there's a range of factors that kind of entered into the decision making around the number and boundaries proposals. There was the overall scale that you need. There was the kind of concepts around environmental catchments and kia tiki tai from mountains to sea, and also the whakapapa linkages. So there's a range of factors flowing into that, but that is an area where the government's asked for feedback over the next month and a bit. One of the advantages of the proposed model is the additional investment capacity and debt capacity that that the reforms would enable. So this graph just shows how much extra borrowing and therefore investment capacity there is when compared with councils currently. So if all councils went across that area, entity B area, went to the upper limits of their debt to revenue ratios, the blue line indicates how much investment could be done, whereas the entities are modelled as being able to invest about 2 to 3 times that, and that's because of the revenue certainty and the regulated environment that the water entities would have. What that also means is that when it comes to investment prioritisation, it's not a case of thinking about how we allocate the existing amount of spend. It is about growing the size of the pie, and that each community would expect to see a greater level of investment. I'm sure you've probably all seen this diagram, so I won't sort of dwell on it, but in the sort of top left corner there, you can see the local authority owners who collectively would appoint representatives to the regional representative group in the model. Similarly, Mana Whenua would appoint representatives to that group as well, who in turn would appoint an independent selection panel to run a merit-based board appointments process. I think we've touched on a lot of the other elements, so we can kind of come back to that if there are any other questions, and we'll speak to the Te Mana o Te Wai statements. So just move on to the next slide now. So just very quickly, in terms of the financial support package, so as you know, at the beginning of this process, the government announced the initial stimulus funding under the kind of COVID Recovery and Response Fund. In Budget 21, it announced 296 million to assist with the costs of transitioning to the new water services arrangements. Obviously, that's kind of conditional on final decisions around reform. And then in July at the Local Government New Zealand conference, the government announced a further $2.5 billion package to support transition. So that has a couple of different elements. It has a $2 billion investment into the future for local government and community wellbeing. So this is not tied to investment in water infrastructure. And the first 500 million of that would become available to councils from 1 July next year. So that's 2022 under the proposals. The package also provided for what's called a no worse off element of funding. I'll just touch on that in a minute. Now I think you can skip the next slide. So just there, the better off funding, so that's the 2 billion that was negotiated with LGNZ and has been allocated on the basis of a national formula. So you can kind of see the allocations there, but I'm sure you would have been informed of those already. Just on the no worse off package, so Obviously, these are quite significant changes, and there are cost implications for local authorities associated with that change process and the transition. So the intention of the No Worse Off package is to effectively compensate local authorities for the direct costs associated with the change. So there is a provision in there for an allowance for stranded overheads. So effectively, as you transfer assets, water debt, revenues, but also staff, that is going to cause an overhang in terms of the overheads. So the government's agreed to a $250 million contribution to manage those stranded overheads. In addition to that, there is provision for a financial sustainability payment. This will only be applicable to a relatively small number of councils. Our analysis shows that for the vast majority of councils, transferring assets, debt and revenues will actually have a positive impact on councils' net financial position in terms of their borrowing capacity and in terms of their credit rating. But for a small number of councils, mostly councils that have very low water debt, there may be an adverse impact, and so the financial sustainability payment is intended to address that impact. So this is the final slide from me before we stop. We're in the middle, as I said, of a two-month engagement process that was negotiated with LGNZ and is intended to help councils consider the local case for change, the reform proposals, get heads around the modelling and the policy proposals, and to provide opportunities like today to ask questions and have those answered. What the government is seeking through this period is feedback on the policy proposals, and it has signalled that it's open to making changes in a number of areas to address some of the concerns that have been expressed, particularly around the sort of the governance and oversight arrangements. We are, question came up earlier around public consultation. The indication at the moment is that this is not the opt-out decision-making period. So there is not a requirement at this stage for public consultation. That the government, following the 8-week window and taking account of the feedback, will then make further decisions around the next steps from here. So this is probably a good place to pause, Craig, and then we can kind of move on to some of these other aspects.
Okay, right. Thanks for that, Nick. So just looking at what's still to come and some of the questions that are up, folks. So the themes I referred to earlier, Nick, last week that came up were kind of in 4 broad areas. There was an ownership theme. I think you've kind of addressed some of that in the slides. We'll see if there's any further questions on that. There was a governance theme, and clearly we've got a couple of governance related questions. There was a consultation theme, and again, we've got some questions on that. And then there was one around cultural values, which you're about to move on to next by the looks of it. So perhaps we could just hold that one for a sec. But some of them do overlap. So just looking at the questions under the governance theme, Councillor Jordan and Councillor Moore, who have both got questions up there. One's around the makeup of the representation group, the 50-50 split on the oversight group. And Councillor Dinny has asked, there's multiple layers in the governance structure, who is accountable to who.
Okay, so if I could address that sort of first point. So the government's been pretty clear that from its perspective, the partnership arrangement between local government and mana whenua in relation to the representative oversight group is a bottom line. What it said is that it's open to, well, firstly, feedback on on the representative and broader kind of governance arrangements, but also it's open to variation in how those kind of configured. So there's no set decision at this stage on the number of representatives or how they've made up or how they're elected or anything like that. And the government's very interested in receiving feedback from councils and from the entity groupings on how that could be done. So the government's arrangements are an area where the government signalled there is kind of potentially room for manoeuvre, but that sort of partnership with mana whenua is important. What your other question around who's accountable to who, except that in terms of the sort of the wiring diagram and the number of sort of actors in the system, if you want to put it in those terms, it is a complex system. So the boards obviously will be accountable to the representative oversight group. So they will have obligations on them to report, to produce annual reports, to undergo audit, but also to front up and be accountable to those representative oversight groups and to explain their performance. So one way to kind of think about those is that those representative oversight groups would perform a similar sort of function to what a shareholders council might, for example, if you had a shareholding model. So many of the same sort of roles that are there. Obviously, though, there are other accountabilities in the system. So the water services entities are also accountable to the regulators. So in terms of the economic regulator, its role will be to set the maximum revenue. So obviously that sets a hard budget constraint that the water services entities will need to live within, and associated with that, there will be a challenge around the efficiency at which they operate. So that's an accountability mechanism there, and the economic regulator will have enforcement powers around that as well. But by and large, that's about delivering services efficiently. There are other mechanisms that are baked into the system as well that represent a form of accountability. So, for example, locally, local mana whenua have the ability to issue, to mana o te wai statements, and the entities will be formally required to respond to those. So that's just kind of a transparency-based accountability mechanism. So the questions about accountability, unfortunately, don't have a simple answer. It is a system that we're talking about, and there are multiple accountabilities to multiple parties as part of the system.
Okay, thanks for that, Nick. So looking to Richard and Denny, are you guys okay at this point with those responses?
It's an answer.
Not really, Craig. I asked them how did the 50-50 arrangement come to be? So what was the basis of coming to 50-50 rather than the total community having 50% and mana whenua having 50%?
So this was a bottom line that was set fairly early on in the process. I think if you kind of go right back to the earlier cabinet papers on the policy proposals back, in sort of mid to late last year, this was a constraint that we've been operating within in terms of the sort of the policy development process. And I guess it's recognition that there are obligations that the Crown has under the Treaty of Waitangi, and Ben, you might want to jump in here, that are important to uphold, and that partnership arrangement implies an equal representation.
Right. Okay. We're just going to move on to the next.
Oh, can I have one, Craig, quickly before they move on?
Is it on governance, Murray?
Yes, it is.
Right, go for it.
With housing and urban development, will the new entities remove the decision making, like e.g. consents and our development plans from local authorities?
No, so the water services entities will be required to seek resource consent in relation to their activity, including new investment. So they will be regulated by regional councils in much the same way that councils currently need to obtain consent, for example, when they're upgrading wastewater plants. So there is no change proposed there in that sense.
Okay, thank you.
Cheers, thanks, Mary. So just flicking on perhaps onto consultation, and as you observed, Nick, Councillor Johnson raised a consultation one earlier. Councillor Bublitz has also got a question up here about need for a referendum, or why is there not a need for a referendum in establishing these entities? Would you like to give us the view on that one?
Yeah, I guess the first thing to say there is that local authorities are entitled to seek views from the public in terms of these proposals, and take that into account when making the feedback. The advice, I guess, at this point is that there isn't a decision that's being sought at the moment, and therefore what is it that's being consulted on? The 2-month period is about getting feedback on the policy proposals. So that's the focus, and that's what was negotiated and agreed with LGNZ. There was concern about how quickly the reforms were proceeding, and the need to take the time for the local government sector to understand the proposal. So that's what we're doing at the moment, and Cabinet has made it clear that it will decide on the next steps, including what the decision-making and consultation process looks like following this 2-month period.
Can I just have a
Yes, go for it, please. Go for it, David. Yeah, sure.
So just to clarify, the government is not ruling out referendum?
The government hasn't taken any decisions at this stage around what happens after this 2-month period.
Okay, so that can be some communication to public at the moment that decision has not been made, so we can't really comment on it.
I think that a lot of the feedback that's being gathered through that, so we're already hearing a bunch of views coming through from the sector, and expect that will continue. So some of the feedback that we're getting is around the sort of substantive policy proposals, and some of the feedback that we're getting in the LGNZ are receiving around the process that is being followed. So that includes the pace, the timeframes, at what point communities should be consulted, the referenda question. So that's all kind of feedback that's sort of been provided through this period. What I'm conveying is that there hasn't been any government decisions at this point around what the next stage looks like, and so I'm unable to answer precisely the questions that you're seeking.
Okay, thanks for that, Nick. It's a bit of a wait and see, that one, I think, folks. Look, there's another theme popped up here, just juggling these questions in my screen here, what I might call the case for change, the numbers, claims around efficiencies and things, Nick. So there's about 3 here on that theme, starting with Councillor Bublitz has said, when you talk about efficiency savings of 45%, is this related to the numbers that have been published on the dashboard around household costs with and without reform? This has come up a few times, this efficiency one, so perhaps you'd like to just give us a quick few thoughts on that one.
Yeah, that's right. So what I would say about the local dashboards, of course, is they are a kind of a very simplified picture that's being provided there in an attempt to sort of make it clear that there is a difference. But there's been a substantial amount of modelling and analysis that has been undertaken throughout the reform process, and which is all available on DIA's website. So there has been a large amount of modelling that modelling has taken a range of different approaches and also come up with a range of different investment scenarios. So, you know, as reflected in the sort of the national challenge of between 120 and 185 billion, there is a reasonable degree of uncertainty there as to exactly what those investment numbers will look like. But what the modelling has done is effectively put those through a stress test or a sensitivity analysis, and it said, well, look, what if the investment levels were half of what is being proposed in that central scenario, or what if the efficiencies are half that which are being claimed? Do the results still stack up? And the more detailed analysis that's been done and which has been provided to councils, including the council specific slide packs, show that you know, even if those investment projections are out by a factor of 50%, broadly the conclusions still hold. So that's just sort of one point I want to make there. But the interpretation of that is right, that the factors feeding into those calculations on the dashboards are the investment amounts and the assumed efficiency benefits.
Okay, thanks for that, Nick. And another question on a similar theme from Councillor Bublix. Please explain household costs. We've been told this is not what households will actually be charged. Unsure of the difference. And I think, David, if I may try and interpret that, are you referring to a comment was made last week, and I might bring Dave Langford in here, around those are more like proxy for future costs? Is that what you were getting at?
Yeah, I guess the uncertainty came from me when it had household costs. I immediately thought that would potentially be what the costs would be. And I understand that that's not the case in terms of what the rate will be that will be charged to a household in 2051. And I just want some clarity around, is it just that basically all things going well will be like all things perfect, it'll be about a quarter of what you would end up paying if there was no reform, I guess is my question.
I think the answer to that is, yeah, if things transpire as kind of projected in the models, then that conclusion is true and on average. And it sort of sounds like a slippery way to answer it, but the reality is that if you look across the country at the moment, there is a wide variety of practices currently in terms of how these services are charged for. So just within the Wellington region alone, there's something like 200 separate tariff lines, you know, across the Wellington water councils, for example. There are differences in terms of the charging basis, so fixed and variable, and, you know, some councils have meters and sort of some and charge volumetrically and some don't. And there are differences currently between, for example, what households pay and what businesses and commercial users pay, for example. So whilst it's true that on average households will pay less under reform than they would otherwise have paid on a standalone basis, it's very difficult to kind of drop down and say to, you know, this particular person or this particular household, what difference will it make? Because there will be some, you know, areas that have perhaps been paying not enough for their water services that are going to see some greater rises than, you know, areas that have already been funding their water services to a good level. So slightly long-winded answer, sorry, but hopefully that helps to answer. And if it doesn't, happy to try to answer it again.
Well, I suppose supplementary that I guess the big thing for ratepayers, I guess, is, and the question that comes to everyone's mind as a ratepayer is how much more is it going to cost, or how much less is it going to cost, or what are the costs going to be? And that's where, if we are going down this road, we need to have some kind of clarity around, I guess. Yeah. Because they want it.
Yeah. And so those figures on the dashboards are an attempt to provide an indication of that. And you can kind of think about that in a relative sense in terms of if we're going to do, you know, that level of investment across this area, then on average, this is what it looks like at a household level. But the entities themselves will obviously need to go through a process of, transparent process of putting in place pricing and charging structures and consulting on both the methodology for doing that and what that translates into in terms of customer bills. And that's a process that will have to unfold over time.
Okay, thanks, Nick. David, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, this might be helpful or it might not be. Think of the average household cost as it's been presented a little bit like how when council strikes its rates, we talk about the average household's rates increase, but actually I suppose the average household is a bit of a mythical thing, because by the time you apply things like our differential between rural and commercial and urban properties and other things, individual households will all pay just a little bit different. And I think if you think of the water charges in a similar way, by the time you've kind of taken into account those households on meters, those paying fixed charges, and all the other different tariff structures that are out there, there isn't really an actual household that represents the average.
Yeah.
Does that make any sense?
Yep, it makes perfect sense to me, David. I think we might stop this one here and move on in the interest of time. There's a couple more questions coming up, and Councillor Chong's got one while we're still on the theme of numbers and data and in the previous slides around the job creation. I might get you to just restate that, Murray, just so I totally understand what you're saying there.
Yeah, basically I just worked out the 5,300 to 9,300 jobs, whether they're actual jobs, but that just for our district, and all I took was 2%, because that's basically our percentage population. Just for New Plymouth, that's an extra 120 or 190,000 jobs. Is this acceptable? That's extra jobs that technically our rate and or taxpayers are going to be paying for that.
So if I could just sort of put those numbers into sort of context. So what those employment figures are is looking right across every sector of the economy and estimating the additional employment that's associated with that level of investment. So if you think about it in terms of the sort of the supply chain, it's the it's the engineers that need to design the plants and things. It's the
I realise that.
Yeah, all the construction activity, etc. as well. There is, though, offsetting the employment increase is a significant increase in labour productivity. So those efficiencies that we're sort of talking about more than outweigh, if you like, the additional employment. So the employment's a kind of a benefit, but in terms of how it's paid for, it's paid by delivering the investment more efficiently than it otherwise would be paid, would be undertaken.
Yeah, and seeing it out, it says it's increased GDP. Well, it's all internal, so you're not really increasing the GDP by that much. Which is, I think you said something like 21 to or 15 to 23 billion dollars a year over the 30 years. But you're not really increasing the GDP. You're just shifting the the money around. So
those figures that I'm referring to are the figures that were sort of reported by Deloitte in the work that it did for the department on the economic impacts of reform. Again, through the efficiency improvements, it is possible to kind of create employment without the full costs of that sheeting home to customers.
And how that can be done.
Right, we might leave that one there for now then. I understand my speaker mic's been giving a bit of static and cutout, so sorry about that, folks. I think the whole broadband system nationwide is under a bit of pressure during this lockdown. I've noticed similar things on other Zooms, so I'll try and talk slowly and clearly and directly at the laptop. There are a couple of other questions probably in this theme here as well, Nick, and Councillor Bublitz has asked one about the better off component of the support package. And he's making the point there that with the entities will end up paying for half of it, doesn't that just drop straight back on the ratepayers, or in this case, the consumers?
I think, yeah, there's a lot of discussion that's been had around this, so I'll try to give the short answer of the story. I mean, ultimately, it's consumers and the customers of water services that are the major beneficiaries of these reforms. So, in the government's view, it's appropriate that they share some of the benefit. Obviously, it's you can think about it as a transfer between water services customers and ratepayers, but there's a huge overlap between those two groups.
Yeah, indeed. Okay. So there's several other questions here around Mana Whenua, iwi, the representative oversight group. I'm just going to maybe hold those because you've got a few more slides coming up on that. Is that right, Nick?
Yeah, we might get Nga to sort of talk through to those components of the reforms and then sort of pick up those questions, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure.
That suits me, Craig.
Okay, happy. Thank you, Denny. And there's a couple of others also, Amanda, others have got questions around that same theme. Are you guys happy if we move perhaps through those slides now, and then we'll come back and do a bit of a wrap up on any outstanding questions at the end? Does that sound all right?
Yeah, all good.
Fabulous. Righto, over to you, Nga and Nick, or whoever's running this next bit.
Awesome, kia ora everybody. Just in the interest of time, I will just move through this quickly. Obviously, our contact information details will be circulated after this, so we're available for further follow-up. So right now, we're just going to go into the iwi Māori influence voice part of our work. Just to quickly clarify, I have my colleagues on the line here. Ben Dixon is closer to the policy stuff. I lead out the iwi Māori engagement stuff for the Three Waters Reform Program. So chime in, Ben, if I get this horribly wrong. But however, so just come in, and this may answer some of the questions that have come through the chat already. So as you know, the governance is based on the principle of partnership, where joint oversight will be shared by local government and Mana Whenua and regional representative groups. And so Nick has briefly spoken to this already, but in short, iwi Māori will have their own process, what we're calling a Kaupapa Māori process to arrive to an appropriate representative model. And so it's a key feature of our reform in terms of iwi Māori opportunity. Is we understand that there's challenges that come with that, but as a starting point, we think this is a great starting place in terms of allowing iwi Māori to arrive to an appropriate model. Part of this means obviously a lot of the board competencies that you may already be familiar with, exercise of kaitiakitanga, mātauranga Māori and the like, but I'll quickly run through these. So as part of the step change for iwi Māori rights and interests in Three Waters, so again, going back to that question around the 50-50, like Cabinet has agreed that the reform program will recognise iwi Māori rights and interests. That's the task of our team, is to explore ways in which that can be recognised and provided for in the reform program. And this is what we've come up with initially. And of course, this has been recently agreed by Cabinet. And so as a part of our rights and interests work, there will be statutory recognition of both the treaty and te mana o te wai in legislation. And so just to be clear, yes, the idea is to create some type of some type of alignment with the te mana o te wai as expressed in the NPDC FM. But very clearly, our work has to do with water once it's inside the pipes. We understand that this is hugely unsatisfactory to iwi Māori right throughout the country. They just don't see it that way. But for the purposes of the scope of our work, we're dealing with iwi Māori rights and interests once the water is inside the infrastructure. We don't deal with allocation, we don't deal with water bottling, we don't deal with what is essentially the consenting framework, which is actually administered by Ministry for Environment and is operated by the regional councils. And so coming back to our oversight stuff, again, this means mana whenua will exercise equal rights to local government as a part of that regional representative group. What's fundamental about the Te Mana o Te Wai statements is that they hope to, well, the idea or the intent is to recognise the true home of kaitiakitanga and the devolution of this to the whānau and hapu level, as opposed to pressure alone on iwi officers. As a bottom line, or as a principle of the reform program, the Minister has asked us to ensure that treaty settlements will be upheld. However, feedback from across the motu over the engagement with whānau hapu, iwi, Māori lands trusts, Māori landowners, PSGs, iwi authorities, mātāwaka and urban authorities have all said actually kaitiakitanga needs to be devolved at the whānau and hapu level. And so as a part of that, that's what we're proposing a Te Mana o Te Wai statement can be activated by. It's not simply an iwi authority or PSG, but actually whānau and hapu who can demonstrate a mandate using a Māori process. This to us, in our view, will enhance and provide greater role for Māori and for kaitiaki in the new system. So as a part of this, again, board competencies for the collective membership of the board in the treaty and mātauranga and tikanga Māori and Te Ao Māori, but that a minimum expertise be possessed by individuals of the board in kaitiakitanga, tikanga, mātauranga Māori, and the delivery of water services, which brings me back to that important point around the future of resource management is specifically our work has to do with the delivery of the 3 water services, which are currently a function of council. And so there was another question there about what provision or what resource support will be given to mana whenua. There is, as a part of the transition to the entity, support to participate in transition activities, and then there will be a statutory obligation on the new entities to provide ongoing financial support to enhance capability and capacity of mana whenua and the 3 water system. Probably just one really, I pause on this one slide to make the point that, you know, mana whenua, and this has been point reiterated by the Minister, mana whenua up and down the country have talked about their concern about having no influence in the system. I mean, if I really reiterate the Minister's statements, that's the case already. In theory, none of these mechanisms exist, and if they do exist, they don't exist in the current utility or in the way that Cabinet has agreed for the 3 Waters reform program. So in theory, these mechanisms could not come into force, and you would continue to participate in the existing system that you have, which is, in terms of investment decision making, I'm talking about mana whenua, probably through the long-term planning process. You don't actually have an instrument or mechanism right now that allows you to directly influence investment decision making. Sorry, just to reiterate, this proposes just that. So again, if I think of, as explained about the whole Te Mana o Te Wai and the utility of these things in a different way, we're proposing, so firstly, again, statutory references to give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai, as defined by mana whenua. Now this is another key point here, is that we know that Te Mana o Te Wai is place-based and is defined at place by mana whenua. And that's a key position we're taking in terms of really trying to hold the line on not prescribing in legislation what Te Mana o Te Wai is. And so the way that we are utilising or proposing the use of these statements is to allow mana whenua to prioritise the capacity and capability. These are all different. Mana whenua have different priorities, and as a result, we think that the Te Mana o Te Wai statements will reflect these. And so legislation will broadly describe Te Mana o Te Wai statements. However, to guard against administrative burden, we are suggesting that in terms of transitional provisions, the following tools, documents will be sufficient or can be used in transition. So for example, a Te Mana o Te Wai statement, I mean, again, mana whenua will be provided a resource to develop new ones if they wish, But if they already have an iwi management plan, a cultural impact statement, something else, some type of other provisional document that could articulate te mana o te wai expectations and service delivery and an investment decision making, then these would suffice. And so, or any other statement representing te mana o te wai. And so the Mana Whenua Forum will have a role in providing an advice to the water services entity on ensuring that the right processes and systems are in place to be able to do effect. And as Nick described earlier, the entity boards will have a requirement to respond to the te mana o te wai statements provided by tangata whenua and how these will be given effect to. What does the Three Waters reform mean for you Māori? So this might sound a bit repetitive, but again, the entities will fund, there will be a statutory obligation on the entities to fund and support capability and capacity of mana whenua. This is again consistent with feedback heard all throughout the motu. And then of course they stress the need for a kaupapa Māori approach, and that's to provide mana whenua with the time they need to determine their representatives on the mana whenua group. And so as probably just to pause there and make a note, we understand that many of you are involved with discussions with Donna Flavel and said iwi of ETTB. Donna Flavel sits on our technical working group, and we have been working with the entity to understand how the Crown can better support and what we think is a positive step by those iwi to self-convene and self-coordinate in what they've described as iwi getting in front of the reforms. And so I understand, Neil, you have a role and have had discussions with Taranaki representatives, and I think Luku Moana from Ngāti Hauā in this regard. So again, we'll stay connected with, in terms of our iwi Māori team, with mana whenua throughout the country to assist them with this activity. Part of this, and you might see this in our recent cabinet paper, part of this means thinking about the role of the Crown in supporting iwi Māori. That might mean, and in terms of the prerogative of the Crown, that might mean appointing independent facilitators, people to support iwi of mana to support iwi and guiding them through that process if they wish. Again, there's varied needs for support across the entities. Some have just said, stay away and we'll invite you when we're ready, and we support that of course as well. So coming back to this, we'll, again, further information regarding funding will be made, like this is an immediate transitionary period, will be provided shortly, 3 years from 2024 onwards, again, obligation on the entity to ensure mana whenua support, participation and to support this through funding. So entity oversight and accountability, again, mana whenua around the country, they actually hammered us on this. They said, oh, how can you say that you are guarding against privatization and what will the new accountabilities be? They said that, but they also said that they wanted more accountability, like all throughout this work, they've said that they want more accountability across the system, especially when it comes to those expiring wastewater consents. So the way we've tried to design this, the intent at least, is actually to place mana whenua at every major accountability. So in other words, these activities that you're concerned about, they can only take place if you're a part of them. It's kind of the way that we're baking into the proposals. And so mana whenua will be at every major accountability where matters like this, or in the direction of travel in which to proceed that way, can only happen if you're involved. And so as a part of this, again, there's a commitment to uphold existing treaty settlement obligations and arrangements. Entity B is a particularly complex entity because of the amount of treaty settlement arrangements which we're looking to carry over through transition, obviously in upholding these. And Entity B, we have indicated a huge interest. This detailed policy work is still being undertaken. There'll be consultation requirements on the strategic direction investment plans. Nick has already spoken to this, charging and pricing, etc. There will be mechanisms that enable communities and consumers to participate in entities' decision-making processes. There'll be economic regulation to protect community consumer interests and drive efficiencies. Economic regulation will ask whether the right investment is taking place in the right places and where the customers are paying too much for their services. And of course, there'll be, again, Nick has described this already, and this work sits with MB. Yeah, so again, we come back to our existing, features of the existing planning system, and the conversation. But I'm going to go straight to the point. The conversation from the last slides is this: is that the features for iwi Māori to influence the system just do not exist. They exist currently. Again, you probably influence through long-term plans or through other bespoke or arrangements out of settlement or other informal arrangements. What this does is tries to bring more formality to that. So we're not reliant on good relationships between iwi and councils to get things done. No, these will be formalised in legislation as part of the new system. So again, that's the opportunity here for you Māori, is that you will be able to influence investment decision making, and I mean the actual projects of work contained in the strategic asset management plan. No such mechanisms or instruments for mana whenua, particularly for whānau and hapu, to communicate directly with an entity exists. Yeah. So anyway, I think, yeah, if there's any, leave it to you guys to take questions and see what else can be picked up.
Awesome. Kia ora. No, thanks very much for that. So look, folks, we've got about 7 minutes left on the Zooey. I know everyone's got reasonably busy calendars and other things they have to get to this afternoon, so I'm going to do my best to wrap this up by midday. So just staying on our theme of Māori iwi rights and interest that Nga has just run through some slides on, are there any outstanding questions that have not been answered or you would like a bit of quick further elaboration on at this point before we move off that theme?
Yeah, I do, Craig. I've got a couple of questions.
Cheers, Denny.
First question is just around, are there any specific provisions that will be in place to protect and uphold treaty settlements?
Kia ora, Matua. So the Minister is very clear on this. Like I said, not currently. It will be picked up. If it's not being picked up in our current legislation, we will address it in transition legislation. But this is top of mind to the Minister, and basically the whakaaro is if it gets to the point where we actually have to have a schedule for treaty settlements, and that's what that's what we have to do. But they will be captured. Yes.
I can pick that one up now.
Yeah, sorry.
There's going to be a specific clause in the bill that says that treaty settlements are untouched by the establishment of the water service entities, and that the treaty settlements sit above the water service entity legislation. Cool. And then going forward, there would be likely schedules outlining where, if the responsibilities are transferred from local government to these new water service entities that relate to treaty settlements in terms of the provision of 3 water services, that they will be picked up by the water service entities going forward.
Cool. Just to follow up to that, because obviously with regards to the treaty settlements, are there going to be any alterations in terms of iwi that have settled who have clauses in their deed of settlements regarding waterways, or will it enhance that?
So in terms of, say, if you're looking at the management of the waterways, there's nothing going to change, because obviously these water service entities are still subject to the RMA. And so in terms of the management of the waterway, they'll be subservient to whatever resource management systems in place, and therefore the regulation of the regional councils and the management of that, whether it be jointly managed by regional council and the iwi or just managed by the regional council going forward. So when we're talking about the water service entities, we're really talking about the service provision and the infrastructure that they're developing, not the management of the waterways. So as you know, most treaty settlements in terms of natural resource redress talk about the management of those resources, so that those will still be in place and they'll be subject to that management.
Cool. Just one final one too then, because government's already done multiple breaches of treaty settlements. What are some things that will be put in place to continue to honour those treaty settlements? Because for all iwi and hapu and mana whenua, their biggest concerns is also around, actually the intent may be there, but often at times successive governments have continued to breach, and we don't need to go into the historic past, but there is clear evidence of the intent versus the reality. So I suppose in terms of some of the provisions, I just confidence that the intent is going to be backed up by the action. So you've given us some clear intent that this is going to be a good process. I suppose what I'm asking is legislation, are there any other provisions to help reinforce these pillars that you are wanting to be part of?
I think if you look at the sort of what we're proposing more broadly around the sort of the capability of the board, the systems and processes that then the water service entities will need to give effect to, so, and the regulatory framework around them. So say the regional council will be enforcing the Te Manawa Te Wai statement via the NPS for fresh water. Taumata Arawai, like Katie said before, they'll be regulating in a manner that gives effect to Te Manawa Te Wai. So the broader system and the sort of the competencies at the board level drive that sort of organisational culture to give effect to what the mechanisms that we're putting in place that we think will give effect to the treaty settlements, but also that the treaty itself. So going forward, so we're looking at the whole system and what drives the function and operation of the water service entities and what would be good practice for them. And so looking at the regulatory framework, the directors and the skill sets that they have, and also these mechanisms that they need to give effect to, combined together to, I think, give us some good oversight and some good confidence that they'll be effective in what they're doing in terms of talking about meeting the treaty, giving effect to Te Manawa Te Wai, and providing effective, efficient services for their communities.
Kia ora, Ben. Kia ora ngā mihi.
Right, I'm going to jump in here, folks, because we're rapidly running out of time. So thanks for that kōrero. Look, there are half a dozen questions I see in the chat board that haven't been answered yet, and we've run out of time. So what we're going to do is capture those, and we're going to send those through. Nick has kindly agreed that his team can respond to those offline. We will get answers for them. I'm looking to Charles as our session host to see if he can capture those for us before we go offline. And we will get answers back to you people. So I think we'll finish up now. I just wanted to thank very much our visiting presenters, the team from Taumata Arawai and from DIA. Thank you so much for taking the time to come along and spend a couple of hours with us and work through those issues, those Q&A. We really do appreciate it. We've to our councillors and staff, we've got another session coming up at 1 o'clock, so we'll let you go away and have some lunch, prepare for that, and I'll just round us out with a karakia whakamutanga. Unihia, unihia, unihia i te uru tapanui. Kia wātia, kia mama, tinako, te tinana, te wairoa i te ara takatu. Koira i rongo whakairihia aki ki runga, kia wātia, ai rā, kua wātia, au paumari ai. Have a good afternoon.
Ka kite.
Very much.